Welcome, everybody. My name is Dino Esposito. I work for JetBrains, the ReSharper company. But I have nothing to do personally with ReSharper. I take care of Android for JetBrains. But I also do, as my MVP status, which was confirmed yesterday, no matter it was the April Fool, was nicely because the first email I got, which I displayed on my phone, said, Dino, we renewed your MVP award for 2011. Okay, it's April Fool. When an hour later, checked the same email from Outlook, it said 2014. So hopefully, the last will be the right one. Anyway, so my MVP status is qualifies me as an expert on ASP.NET, as well, also member of the ASP Insiders group, which exists to get free software from vendors and also to possibly give suggestions to Microsoft on how to evolve the ASP.NET platform. And this is the sore point. This is precisely the sore point. Now, just a quick second look at this book, which was published a month ago. It covers the latest version of ASP.NET MVC. So it's probably the last book on a technology I will write in my life. I've been writing technology books for 15 years now. And the world is now completely different from the world it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, there was documentation in first place, official documentation from vendors. So people, authors, could learn in first place, digest the documentation, and then build stories on top of that to make it easier and faster and more effective for other people in the industry, actual developers, to learn effectively and quickly. So still today, I wrote probably 20 books in my career. At conferences, it's not unusual that people stop me and say, look, I just want to say hi and thanks because you made me a developer. I grew up with your books and I learned all I know today because of your books. But this is not something that can happen to the next generation of developers because the world is different. There is no this documentation has disappeared, and I cannot, me, any other people who writes book, cannot honestly write books learning how it works first and then explaining things to people. It takes time. It's not impossible. It takes time and nobody has the time. We don't have the time and the revenues, okay? It's not worthwhile financially to do this. And developers in the wild have no time to learn. It's the time of everything has to be, in which everything has to be quick. Show me the code. Okay. Show me the code. So, in this book, which I wrote across last summer, I was not supposed to have a chapter on ASP.NET Identity because there was no ASP.NET Identity up to August, or at least no build that could be usable. Because when you are a member of the ISP Insiders group, you have in theory, access to every single build of platform or surrounding frameworks, even nightly build. I just don't want. I couldn't care less. Just, if you don't trust what you're doing and if you don't want to actually share with the wild, why should I? I don't have time to waste. There's no money, but I have to pay my bills, right? Like you. So there's no money for me in checking your nightly builds. Okay? So in August, there was nothing that was worthwhile to be included in the book. In October, when the book was going to be finished, appeared ASP.NET Identity version 1. Okay, let's wrap up. And I added in the security chapter of the book, a short wrap-up of identity. But in the short time between the first draft of the chapter, the technical review and the second author pass on the chapter after the technical review has been done, it changed it completely. The API was completely different. The logic, the behavior, the overall behavior remained the same. So the philosophy behind the framework was the same. But the actual API, the name of the methods, the classes were completely different. So today, in this book, you will find, in the end, coverage, basic coverage of ASP.NET Identity. But if today I invite you to buy that book, to say it covers, it's probably the only book at the moment that covers ASP.NET Identity, you likely will be disappointed of the content there. Because March, 10 days ago, March 20, I think, they released Identity 2. Because meanwhile, between version 1, which was released in mid-October, and version 2, mid-March, 5 months later, meanwhile, they realized, oh my God, we missed the list of users. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. In Identity 1, there is no API, no way, no way in the official provider interface to get the list of users. We missed it. Fuck, you missed it. And they released Identity 2 last week, 2 weeks ago. So, this is the world, the crazy world in which we live. Which leads me to this tweet that I made yesterday. My 4 steps to a great presentation. I think that I'm not exaggerating if I call myself, and sorry if I look, to have a huge ego. I've been told, okay, it's not my fault, I've been told for 15 years, right? That I probably have a good talent at telling people stories, technical stories. So tell the story, so make everything look nice in context is fundamental for any kind of presentation, regardless of the scenario where you give that presentation. So that's the first point. Tell me the story. We are developers, show me the code. But if I show you the code without telling you the story, I'm kind of keeping you off the real context. Because we write software, right, but we write software for the real world, to solve real problems. That's what we do. What they do in Redmond, I don't know. But here we write software to address specific problems that live in a context. Without the context, we wouldn't call to write any kind of software. But any software, and because it lives in a context, it must obey general rules. We call usually business rules. And to address business rules, it took 20 years before we got it. We cannot simply, follow rules by adding ifs, if statements, or maybe a switch statement if you want to be smart. Okay, we need to step up and try to grab the sense of the domain where the context, the business context originates. So we need to understand the rules of good architecture on one end and business domain rules on the other end. And we need to be able to mix the two things together. So yesterday, anybody attended my presentation on MVC5? Quite a few people. At least 2 times yesterday, I told you specifically by following the, let's say, official, classic learning path that is pushed your way, you probably see just one segment of the big picture. And specifically, I referred yesterday to the layered architecture, which is the state-of-the-art modern architecture, which is the evolution of the classic 3-tier pattern: presentation, business, and data access. But if you want to learn, or want your developers, your junior developers, learn how to do good ASP.NET programming, the most reasonable thing you do is pointing them to tutorials on the website, the Microsoft website, and most of the articles, posts that you find all over the place. And the most architecturally advanced kind of thing you find is there's a controller here, and just because it's a controller, it's smart. But the controller is like button one click we had in web forms for 10 years. And then there are repositories, so other classes that just wrap up data access. You have separation, for sure, but it's not enough. So it's much better than having any code into the controller, because the controller is smart, it's cool. So separation, controller, repository is one key step, but it's not enough. So by forcing you to look into that as the best practice, I mean, it's a good practice, sure, but it's not the best practice. And good is not enough. I mean, it's enough if you write the music store or the pet store simple application, but when you start having a little bit of business logic, and it doesn't have much more sophisticated than just validation, that's enough. Good is not exactly what you want. And best, which is more than good, comes at nearly no cost. The only cost is understanding that there's a slightly bigger picture. But your narrow, focused vision you inherit is limiting you. That's the point. So ask yourself, that's the fundamental issue in point 3 here. Let me see the general rules. Try to wonder whether there is a bigger picture you're missing. In a great presentation, my honest opinion, this is a fundamental point. At that point, re-show me the code so that I can put it in the right context, and even I can be able to find to the code and the technology, even the simple, stupid code you're showing me, I can find a place in my context, in my business, and make use and have some takeaways out of the room. Okay, ASP.NET Identity. It's yet another membership API. It's exactly that. Now, as a member of the Asp Insiders group, for the past couple of years, I've seen coming in my inbox dozens and dozens of emails asking Microsoft to do something to fix the issues of the membership provider class that has been around, and it's still around since 2005. So Microsoft, in 2005, when they released .NET 2 and ASP.NET 2, they gave us, and that was probably the last well-done chunk of code they did, they gave us a membership subsystem. So basically, you should be familiar with that, because it's exactly what you are probably using now to implement membership systems, roles, users, change of password in your web-based systems, whether you use MVC or you use web forms, it doesn't matter. But the membership mechanism was based on a provider class, which was encapsulating data access, so which was responsible for retrieving and saving user information, their passwords, their roles. And the default implementation of the membership provider was using a SQL Server table with a fixed schema, created using a separate command line tool. And also, at some point, they gave us a web-based interface based on localhost to edit with a graphical tool to handle the structure of the database. But it worked. They also made the provider pluggable in the sense that you could easily create your own provider to replace not much the logic, actually, because a membership component doesn't need to do extra things. It needs to allow you to do some CRUD on users, roles, managing the association between users and roles, change the password, log in and log out. That's it. So by creating a custom membership provider, you don't want probably to implement sophisticated, innovative logic. All you want to change is the structure of the storage. And maybe you want to change the definition of the user. So what is, with a modern term, is called claims about the user. So not just the name and the password, but also the email, the age, the birthday, I don't know. Whatever, it's important in the context of your app to identify the user. So the information you want to have always at hand when it comes to managing users. So these are the two things, store and user definition. So now if we, okay, the membership provider so was fun, was okay, but when people started creating custom providers, because the most common reason for creating a custom provider was, okay, fine, I love it, but I have already my database of users, and it doesn't match, of course, the default schema that the membership API supports. So in nearly any ASP.NET application I wrote since 2005, I had at some point to recreate my custom membership provider to wrap up access to a different database, mostly SQL Server, saving users according to my own schema. When it comes to this, you figure out that building a membership provider is inheriting a class from a base Microsoft provider class, which has 25 methods. And you probably need to override just one. Validate, in most cases, it's just one. Validate credentials. So the method that just checks the credentials provided against your database. That's the only part you need to change for sure. Everything else, for the most part, is throw not implemented exception or just go with the base implementation. Except that the membership class is, for the most part, abstract. So you still have to write code. So that it's a patent violation of the I in the solid acronym. The I stands for interface segregation, which says exactly try to keep your interfaces as thin as possible. And maybe if there are several functions to be incorporated in a class, split those functionalities in different groups, because thanks God, interfaces can be combined together. So you can have multiple interfaces implemented out of the same class. It's not like inheritance, which is limited to just one. This is what interface segregation principle says, which was patently violated in the implementation of role provider and membership provider classes. But that was 2005. In 2005, there was no idea of complex things like solid, like principles. It was still the Visual Basic age. Just make it work. Just put a button, click, and it goes. It was a different, totally, completely different time. But membership API has been still there for years. At some point, when Microsoft released, what was that? Another thing that I'm still researching the rationale, web pages. I still don't know web metrics and web pages. I still can't find any justification for that. They put out simple membership because they said, look, if we have some ideas willing to do ASP.NET programming and cannot afford learning ASP.NET and they want to use something simplified, like web pages, which is exactly the same by the way, then let me give these guys something simpler to do membership. So they created a simple membership, which at some point, with MVC4, I think, also became the standard way of doing identity stuff. And curiously, that standard way means we use this API in the typical template that Visual Studio creates for you, which is an amazing way of defining a standard. We use in our demo, which is one of those horrible pieces of code I have ever seen, but anyway, we use it now. You want to create a new application? Go through the wizard, This is what the wizard gave you, which is horrible. But it uses simple membership, so it becomes a standard. So, to cut a long story short, identity comes as a way to make justice of membership because it was overly complex, bloated interface, and simple membership, which was just a silly attempt to make things simpler. Now, ASP.NET Identity is sold as a change, one of the key changes in ASP.NET MVC 5, which is true and false at the same time, because identity is just a membership API that works across the entire ASP.NET platform. So it's not MVC specific. If you happen to write web form or maintain web forms applications and want to evolve them to use identity, which makes sense actually, which could make sense. Yeah, you can use identity, so it's not limited to MVC. Okay, let's start to refresh your mind. Let me bring up an example. What it is, a sample membership provider. So this is a typical implementation of a class. It inherits from a membership provider, and then it needs to do quite a few overrides because all those members are marked abstract on the base class. And at the end of the day, this is the only method you really want to override, because it's where you decide whether provided credentials are valid or not. Everything else, get user, get password, change password, may or may not be part of the system. In particular, in this sample, this is a piece of a booking system, so it's a production app. In this particular context, you will see that the create user is nearly empty, so it doesn't actually create a user because the creation of users never happens, because that's a strict requirement of the app, programmatically via software, but it happens via the back office or via physical contact between people. So you go to the club, it's a booking system for a club, sporting club, so you have to go there, ask specifically face-to-face to be added as a user. So there's an admin interface that creates a user, but it doesn't do that through the membership API. It just adds a record into the user's table using a different mechanism. So the membership API, which is used only to log in and out, forces me to override the create user, but just to return null. And you see that the membership user, it's a definition of what a user is in the context of the API, and it's not something you can change. So that's it. It may have fewer, too many properties, whatever, regardless. That's what that is made available, and there's no way for you to change it. So if it contains fewer properties, that's a problem. If it contains too many properties, okay, you have to live with that. So these are the two big issues. The overly complex structure of the provider, which was essentially required only to manage a different non-default store, and the definition of the user. And these are, there's a similar, just for completeness, structure for roles, for managing roles. Control-M-O. Except that the interface is only a little bit, the base class role provider is only a little bit simpler, has only fewer methods, get all roles for user, in role, and is user in role. Okay, so the purpose of identity is trying to make this more flexible and simpler to use. It is centered on an object called user manager. And the user manager has two guys to help: the authentication manager and the store manager. Persistence of the user information is managed by default using entity framework, and in particular code first. Familiar with code first? Okay. So it means that there is a base class that describes the user, but now it's an extremely basic, minimal user class. It only has two properties, not even three. It has ID, which makes no sense, and username, because you have a username. The username is supposed to be unique, so why the ID? Okay, it's amazing. And it doesn't have password. Now, I mean, the official definition of user doesn't include the password. Is it stupid? Is it idiot? Is it moron? Or is it me missing the point of not having a password? I assume that there's probably exists some logic in not putting the password field, the password property, on the minimal definition of the user, because this API integrates well with the social authentication or auth. So in those situations, what you get is a username from Facebook, Twitter, Google+, whatever you use for LinkedIn, whatever you use for social authentication, but you don't get that password, because the password remains by design on the external OAuth provider. So probably this is the reason why there is no password defined. But at the same time, they tried, Microsoft designers tried to unify the support for social and local authentication. And if I do local authentication, I need a password. I definitely need a password. So at the end of the day, 99.99% of the time, you must create your own user to add, at the very minimum, the password field. Okay? And here is some code. It gives you this is code just taken out of the original identity source code that gives you the description of what is the the definition of user manager and iUser. So user manager is a generic class which accepts a T-user type, which is expected to implement iUser, and this is iUser. String ID and string username. This is read only. This is get set, and I don't know. This is what they done. I don't see the point of in ID, and I don't see the point of this being read only, and this is to be get set. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would consider one property to identify uniquely the user. And okay, that property could be just read-only, because, I mean, in an interface, it could be defined as read-only, because I expect to have a sort of constructor or a factory on the class that implements the interface where this value here is injected. So to create a user, I use a constructor or a factory which requires me to pass the ID or username, whatever it is. So probably, I mean, but just trying to guess, to read their minds, this is the primary key, so to speak, and the username is just the display name. I assume that this could be a possible way of reading and trying to understand this interface. If there were some documentation, we could probably have clearer ideas of the rationale, the motivation for this choice. So without documentation, we can only look at the code. This is the code, and on top of this code, we can only make our guesses. Okay, let me now show you some code. I want to play dirty. I want to play dirty, and let me first create a brand new project using Visual Studio 2013 and MVC 5. But I mean, MVC or web forms in this context is really transparent. Really, that doesn't really make any significant change. So web application. Let me put this folder I can happily get rid of. Okay, so this is the new wizard. Let's say we want to create an MVC application. Change authentication. This is a nice piece of wizard which allows you to choose 4 options, 2 of which are of no interest. No authentication and individual authentication. These are because organizational accounts has to do with Active Directory. And if you are, I think that's my guess, if you are using Active Directory, you're not passing through the wizard here. And also Windows authentication makes no sense for most of the situations. So, okay, let's go with individual user account. And let's see what we get. It takes ages because, because of the computer, but also because it is adding a gazillion of different references to different Bootstrap, Grease, things that I just don't use. So the most obvious approach is starting from an empty project and then just add what you need via NuGet. So that's probably the most reasonable approach. Okay, this is, thanks God, the app up and running, and you see that if I just run this, okay, no matter the NuGet errors, the default app should be able to support immediately users that can be created, registered. Fantastic. Playing title, whatever. I have no idea what's going on here. Okay, doesn't matter. Let me kill Dropbox. Now, there is a home controller and an account controller. The account controller is rather bloated. I would say unreadable, hardly intelligible. Okay, it works, because it works. But it's not, honestly, something I would call readable. So trying to make sense of the whole thing here. Okay, we see that the account controller class is injected user manager of application user. This is the definition of the user for this application. This is not a class in the framework, but this is a class in the application. Then the user manager constructor is injected an instance of user store of T, and T is again application user. So user store is capable of managing the storage of application user type. And the user store in turn is injected the tool that manages persistence, and it's application DB context. So there are 3 levels of injection. User manager, which is injected, user store, which in turn is injected. the DB context, which is just a wrapper around the entity framework. Okay. Then we have, and this is also from the number of references, you can guess that, there is the key property on this class, which is a property called user manager of type user manager of T, which is as a public getter and a private setter. So this is the public interface, the tool that you use to do everything from your own code. So essentially to log in and log out users. And then there are a few methods. There is a login method. This is the get and this is the post. There's a register, get and post. There is a disassociate, manage. Again, this is, in my opinion, the perfect example of confusion, of showing you the code without giving you the context. I mean, I was looking into a few of your faces with people here sitting in front of me, and up 10-15 seconds ago, I had a few guys here in particular, because you are just in front of me, their faces were saying, yes, I'm getting the point, I'm getting the point. Disassociate, what's the point? I mean, that was my interpretation. Okay? And actually, I'm not saying that disassociate or manage are out of place here, but they add an extra level of complexity. They essentially are methods put into the account controller to give you a programmatic way of disassociating, of breaking the association between a local and a social account. So the key idea behind identity, and more importantly, one of the aspects of the identity API is trying to unify authentication that happens socially through Facebook, Twitter, and social providers, and locally, so through your own code, the classic membership code. Okay? So the idea, and it's not bad, is that you have a list of local accounts, user objects, that have in turn associated multiple logins. That's the term used in the API, where a login could be a local login, so username and password, or it could be references to authenticate via Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. So this associate is a way to, okay, the user at this point decides that it doesn't want to be given the chance to authenticate via Twitter. So it wants to tell the API to remove the possibility of authenticating via Twitter. So it's just like when you deny permission as a Twitter user to an external application to use the services of Twitter. So this is the purpose of disassociate, which is, it's not a bad idea, but put in the context of a basic application like this, to me it appears a little bit too much at this level. And manage is simply the API to modify the user. So edit profile, essentially. External login and external login callback, these are interesting, even though the name is probably not completely clear about the purpose of those two methods. They serve the purpose of authenticating socially. So it's essentially the API through which Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all of the supported provider or host provider pass through. So you need to have these two guys, okay, if you want to support social OAuth authentication. Link login, I have no idea what this is. External login confirmation, log off, okay, makes sense. Fail or remove account list, and there's a lot of noise. So, if you want to understand how it works, you get rid of all this crap and start from scratch and use this particular example. Now, I want to, again, spend a few moments, few seconds to tell you, sorry about that, personal story. Happened not that many days ago. I wrote an article for MSDN magazine on identity. The first article I wrote has been published on the March issue. And the article I'm talking about will probably appear on the May issue. And it's based exactly on the code I'm going to present right now. And the technical reviewer of the article was the PM of ASP.NET Identity. And the comment, and I got back from the editor, was, "This is great stuff, people will love it." I bet, of course I would say, because it probably explains how it should be told, how the story about identity should be told to people. And the core of that article, which will appear probably on May, is this code here, in which essentially I started from scratch. Empty project. And let me close everything and really start from scratch. So I have a home controller here, which only has a few stupid demo things. Then you see that I have 3 controllers that may be related in some way to security, to authentication actually. There is the login controller, there is the identity controller, and the account controller. So what's the relationship now between these 3 guys? In the hope of having used the right terms, English-wise, login controller is the controller that I use to log in and log out. That's it. That's the only responsibility of that controller. Account is the controller that I use for more advanced and specific things like changing user information, editing the profile, or changing the password, or setting or resetting the password. Identity controller, however, is a common base class that both account and login inherit from, which is going to be constant, invariant, just a base class, that provides a lot of the necessary noise that makes identity work. So this means that most of the, actually identity controller is heavily based on the code that Microsoft provides through the standard authentication code. So that code is not crap, totally crap. The organization of the code that doesn't tell you the right story. So let's start. So if you want to see the juice of identity, you have to look into identity controller, but let's start from login controller instead. As you can see, it only has 3 methods. Sign in, sign out, and Twitter. Twitter is, because this sample application only supports Twitter for social authentication. Imagine you have here Facebook, blah, blah, blah. Or probably you can try to only have a social here and use the name of the social provider as a parameter. Login controller inherits from identity controller. And that's interesting. I mean, this is my way of rewriting the code. It only provides identity user and identity DB context at the same level, not through 3 levels of injections. Okay, we're talking about generics, but the concept is the same. So the class identity controller has 2 parametric types. One is how the user is done, and second is how I persist it. There is a bit of simplification here, in the sense that identity DB context, the suffix DB context makes it clear, I'm not really changing the API for persistence. So the actual database, it's always the same, so it's entity framework. As the next demo, I will show you how to customize identity to use RavenDB, a NoSQL store, okay, to persist data. In that case, if you want to add the extra level of extensibility that not just changes the shape of the data, because with MDB there's no schema, but just changes the logic, the store, the physical store, probably this interface has to be, this login class has to be made a little bit more flexible, and probably adding a term type here, or maybe replacing DB context with the store type. And the store type in turn needs to be injected the DB context, so the entry point, the context object to do database access. But anyway, with this simple definition, okay, this is a fairly simple class, and this is enough to manage my login and logout. Let me show you what it takes to have sign in. Code is fairly trivial because the get method, so that displays the login page. We are talking about login, the regular login where you enter username and password. It just sets the return URL, the remember me to a default value, and just displays the form. So there's nothing special here. The post checks the model, the login view model, so username, password, maybe remember me, everything is okay there. Then this is a way to interface the identity low-level API. So it first finds the user, checks to see if the user exists in the store we have. So it uses user manager. User manager is a property defined on the base class identity controller. So you assume you have a user manager object that you use to query against the user backend that you created, right? So you have, okay, tell me about the user with this name and this password. If we get the user, if it's not null, we just sign in the user. This is another method on the base class, and we redirect to the return URL. Trivial, clear. Otherwise, okay, model say add error, model return message display to user. That's fairly trivial, right? If you think back for a moment to the structure of this code in the old days of ASP.NET. You replace user manager with forms authentication, the class forms authentication, and the methods of those on that class, and it's there. And it's there. So the logic is extremely simple, clear, fluid. Okay, for sign out, same story. We use to sign out Authentication Manager. Actually, Authentication Manager, more than User Manager, is the counterpart to Forms Authentication that we use for years in plain ASP.NET. In fact, if you remember, on Form Authentication class, there is a static method called Logout or sign off, whatever, which has a similar structure like this. Now, a sign out takes a couple of parameters. These parameters express the flexibility of the ASP.NET Identity API, in the sense that this is an important change that will become clearer probably already this afternoon as build starts in San Francisco, or maybe next month with TechEd, because Microsoft is going to make important announcements. Everybody knows about this kind of announcement, so it's no secret here, about the future, VNext, blah, 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 blah. But if you've been on the news, on the updates, ASP.NET related, you have heard about OWIN. Okay, so it's been on everybody's mouth. OWIN is going to play a key role, essential role in the future of the Microsoft web stack. So maybe next year, maybe in 2 years from now, as soon as IIS, ASP.NET VNext, Visual Studio VNext, .NET VNext will see the light, OWIN will be everywhere. And this is an excellent point, because if someone passes me, and this happened, an article, what do you think about Katana, OWIN, blah, 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 blah. I read the article and I say, okay, I couldn't care less. It doesn't change my life. I actually write applications today. I couldn't care less. But if I try to make sense of what OWIN represents, wow, it's great. It's a great idea. I wish they had this idea and implementation way back. Because OWIN is all about decoupling the web server and the client. So ASP.NET becomes just one possible client of IIS. And your applications become just one possible client of your pages or your single page applications. Your HTML pages become just one possible. So in other words, every HTTP-based interaction is managed through the general interface of OWIN. OWIN is an interface, okay, that sets how interaction between client and web servers should occur. What's different today is that it's the ASP.NET runtime. That's the issue. What we generically call the ASP.NET runtime, so the HTTP handlers, HTTP modules, HTTP context, the pipeline, the sequence of events, begin request, end request, everything that happens along the way, output cache, authentication, authorization, all those steps are hard-coded. So they have not an open interface, but they are hard-coded. What was the tight integration between ASP.NET and IIS, which was all about the improvement in IIS 7, if you remember that, you know, the integrated pipeline mode, which was sold as the greatest advance in technology only a few years ago. Today, said it's the worst mistake we made in the history of software. OWIN denies that. It's about tight coupling, integrated pipeline, versus low scoping, OWIN. So we are moving now from tight coupling towards a world in which everything is as loosely coupled as possible. This is the important change that OWIN is carrying. But it's not a change that happens today. So today, learning about OWIN beyond the big picture, to me, makes no sense at all, because it doesn't change your life as developers, or my life as a developer. In the future, maybe next year, I don't know when my ASP.NET new will be out, Web API new will be out, IIS 9 or whatever will be out, that's a different story, because at that point, OWIN will become a new API to learn. But nobody knows today which kind of form or shape or colors that actual API is going to have. We know generically about the interface of OWIN. But this is only to call your attention on the fact that OWIN is going to be important, but probably not today. So if you have time, try to make sense of what it means, how it works. But today, it doesn't change your life. So, back to this code. OWIN also brings the idea of generalizing all the possible steps that take place in what today we call the HTTP pipeline. And one of the steps, as far as authentication is concerned, is the creation of the cookie. What in ASP.NET is called the ISPX auth cookie. That cookie is gone, replaced by other cookies. And in fact, if you use with this sample app here, if you use Fiddler, you will see that when a user of this app is authenticated, there's still a cookie that travels with each request, but it has a different name. So essentially, they are trying to abstract concepts, and using the cookie to track user information is one possible way, and the structure of the cookie, the content of the cookie may change according to the OWIN implementation that the particular web server is going to offer. So this is, we are simply saying, hey, look, this form of authentication may be based on two cookies, the application cookie and or the external cookie coming from Twitter or Facebook or typically social or both authentication providers. So it means when you sign out, look, there might be two different cookies to look at. The application cookie is the classic, is the general form of the classic ASP.NET Forms authentication cookie. And finally, Twitter. Yeah, this is what all that you need to have if you want to authenticate via Twitter, and for Facebook is exactly the same code. The code you just change provider name there. Instead of Twitter, you use Facebook. The problem here is that to authenticate via Twitter or via Facebook, you need to have a Facebook or Twitter application configured on some Twitter and Facebook account. So that's why so from the perspective of the ASP.NET developer, it's all about changing the value of the provider variable there. But it only works if there are some other parts of the code, the upstart here, where essentially I have to enter this information here, and this information says that I can use Twitter as long as Twitter recognizes this consumer key and this consumer secret, and these are my own codes. So because I went to, with my own account, Twitter account, I went to the dev.twitter.com, I created a Twitter app, Twitter gave me these strings, and in doing so, Twitter gave me, created for me a sort of proxy that my code, my ASP.NET or WPF or whatever code will use to interact with the Twitter API. So Twitter is not giving me direct access to the API. It always creates me a proxy, and this proxy has the name of a Twitter application, and it is identified by consumer key and consumer secret. So I need to have this configured in order to just change the provider name to from Twitter to Facebook in my login controller code. But beyond that, once the social provider is configured, all I do is, challenge result is another class, part of the framework, just now borrowed from the Microsoft code. So challenge result is not part of the framework, of the official framework, but it's part of the demo code they created. So I incorporated that into the identity controller class. But actually, this class doesn't do anything special. All it does is calling, this is critical code it uses. Use the fluent interface to make it easier to read. All it does is calling the challenge method on the authentication object out of the OWIN context. Now, how can I? This will probably, with a little bit of refactoring on names, so this will become probably the way to go in the future. So probably instead of HTTP context, it's my guess, you can have an OWIN context, or maybe an HTTP context that has the form of the OWIN context today. But regardless of the name changes, the functionalities, the actual behavior will remain the same and will reflect, mirror the steps we can recognize today in the HTTP pipeline. Okay? So it's just a matter of getting familiar with new terms and slightly more abstract concepts, but nothing is really new. So what happens here in a get all win context authentication? Today, NDC5, the object underneath authentication is an instance of false authentication. Sort of that, yeah. And challenge is simply an extension method that wraps up the mechanics of the OAuth protocol. The OAuth protocol is boring from the perspective of most developers. I'm the first. Because it requires that you set up 2 calls, so it's just a handshake mechanism. So you send a request, you get a response, you send another request. So all of this exchange of information, the handshaking between your web server and the Twitter, Facebook, the social provider, is hidden into the challenge. So try to establish a login successfully with the provider. And this is login provider, this is the name, and this is just a name, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. But underneath that name, we find the details, the information that is written here. And okay, so back to the code you actually write. This is it. So to change this to Facebook, modify this string and configure a Facebook application here. So there's another method called, you see, yeah, it's commented. Just get your app ID and app secrets from your Facebook application configured in developers.facebook.com. Oops. And after that, so this is for sending the request to Twitter. And at the end of the day, when this method returns, you are displayed the Twitter login page. You enter your Twitter credentials, you authorize the proxy created to operate on behalf of the application. You authorize the application driving the proxy to behave as if it were the original user. And external login callback is the return point. So once Twitter has successfully authenticated the user, it redirects back to this action. External login callback. Now, these are just this is your string, this is your method. You can change the name if you don't like this. So external login callback, if it scares you because, call it foo, give it your dog's name, it doesn't matter, it's your code, okay? It's your code and your readability issues. Okay, finally, the next step is, when you're back here, authentication via Twitter has successfully occurred. Okay, if this is null, so you call the Authentication Manager, which knows the details of the OAuth communication, to get external login info. Again, the name, no, in this case, external login on the Authentication Manager, this is a name you cannot change. It has to remain external login, actually. But anyway, with this method, part of the API, you grab login information made available by the social service. So you get the username of Twitter, you get the potentially any information that Facebook makes available, so the birthday of the user, the email of the user. At the very minimum, you get the username. And if for some reasons the authentication failed because the password was not correctly inserted, or maybe the user canceled the authentication because he was scared by the permission the proxy requested, login info is null, and you just redirect back to the sign-in page. Otherwise, your next problem is how to use the information you just got from Twitter to create a user within the context of your application. So get basic user identity is a custom method I created in it's a protected method on the identity-based class controller. And show you the implementation, which has a very, very basic implementation. So it gets the name of the user, right? Because login info default username is what we pass. And we just create a list of claims. Claim is system security claims, class of .NET Framework. And we say, look, the list of claims for a very basic user identity contains the name of the user. So claim type's name is just a key in a sort of dictionary to say this is a name and this is the actual value. So you have to think of the list of claims here as a sort of dictionary in which the key column contains the type of the claim, so the piece of information we have about the user. So claim types.name indicates, okay, this is the name of the user, but other options are other date of birth, or email, or gender, given name. So there are several, it's a generic enum type, right? So it indicates specifically what type of information you are making available about the user. At the very minimum, you want to make available the username. And this is what we do here. And after that, we create a claims identity type, which is built on top of the list we just created, and says, look, this is going to use the regular authentication cookie. So these claims are going to be saved in the regular application cookie. So it's just like, this saves us a lot of the burden that years ago, and still today if we use the regular ASP.NET authentication, we have to create your own custom principal to save extra information. The regular cookie contains only the username in ASP.NET today, right? If you want to store extra information, the cookie, the forms cookie object contains an extra data field that contains a string, and in that string, serialized using your own algorithm, you can put any extra data you want. But then, to make that data available through the HTTP context.user, you have to create a custom principal object that just adds the extra properties, put in this principal custom the deserialization logic that reads the string and extracts pieces of info. So if you have email and birthday, you will want to say email, pipe, email, or comma email. That's your custom serialization, and you have to deserialize that back to distinct pieces of info, birthday and email, and expose this through the custom user object you create. So it's all code you have to write over and over and over again at your own expenses. This is done through the claims interface and the claims identity class generically. So this is an enhancement that doesn't come directly with identity, but is beneficial also to identity. And this says that these claims are going to be saved into the cookie, authentication cookie for this application. Okay. At this point, once we have the identity, all we do is call sign in and say, look, sign this user in. Okay, we want a persistent cookie, and we pass the identity object. What's this commented code here? This is another, the commented code here is another way of doing the same. Actually, in this case, much simpler. It doesn't pass through claims. So I call it get basic user identity because it gives you the infrastructure for you to add multiple claims, like email, whatever. But if you just want to deal with username and you don't care about possibly extra pieces of information, the commanded code is all you need, and it's probably also easier to figure out because it creates a new instance of the user. Okay, application user, that's your user object. The username is whatever comes from the login information. You sign in using the default value for authentication properties, or you can sign in, okay, synchronously or asynchronously, and that's it. So this is 3 out of these 4 lines are what you need if you want to have the default behavior of authentication as you have it today, that only cares about the username. If you want to care about the username and possibly more, maybe in the next release, you might want to use, for the same purposes, the 3 lines and get basic user identity, which I think is protected virtual in identity controller, so that you can easily override that method in your own implementation to customize with minimal effort. And now, account controller just deals with the registration of new users. And it contains nothing really special. This is the post method. It gets input data via the view model, extracts information from the input model and creates an identity user. Actually, yeah, I used application user, but actually it was an identity user, so it was example code there. So identity user is the base class of users in this application, this example. So you create the user, you create on the user manager the user passing the information here, and also adding the password, because it's required to be a separate parameter. And if you succeed, you send in the user. So nothing special, just plain code using a slightly different and more general, more abstract API. Finally, I want to offer you a view, a perspective of the code in identity controller, so that the real code that runs underneath. Identity controller, T-user and T-DB context. T-user needs to be identity user or a further derived class. Identity user is, as you see there, is a Microsoft class. And typically in your applications, you might want to derive, I'm not sure I do this right here. No, I'm not using that, but if you want to have your own custom class, you just add your custom class and inherit that from identity user. What Microsoft does in the code that you have free from the wizard is they give you application user class right in the project that simply inherits from identity user without adding any extra method. Okay? Identity user is not, let me see, okay, just equals new identity user dot. So you find quite a few properties here. So identity user is not iUser, the interface. Identity user is a real class with quite a few properties. It has ID, it has username, it has roles, it has password hash, because the manipulation of passwords is automatically going through hashes. If you want to, and I invite you to go through this code and the other example that I'm going to show you in a few moments, you will find an implementation of the password hasher. So in this way, you don't even have to care about, oh my God, I want to hash password, but I don't have it. There's a predefined class that just automatically hashes passwords. You also have a security stamp, which is a date time. And okay, if this information is not enough, you are welcome to derive a new class and add as many properties, extra properties, as you like. So, identity controller just saves an instance of user manager. Here we go. It also has an authentication manager, which is just the get all in context authentication I have a sign in that simply creates. So when you sign in a user, first everybody is signed out. Any external cookie is signed out, and a new identity is created. And the commented code here shows what to do if you want to add extra claims, like name, email. Of course, as long as this extra information for the claims are coming your way through the definition of the user class. Because if you don't have an email on the user, there's not much you can add here, except a constant maybe. Okay? And then sign in. So you need to have an identity object, either created, returned by user manager, or created by you by putting together a list of custom claims. And you call sign in on Authentication Manager, and this is framework code. Redirect to local, plain code, get basic user identity. So these are just a few. Oh, I didn't make this virtual. You can make this virtual if you want to easily override in derived classes. So this splits the complexity of identity in 3 blocks. Login, 3 methods. Login, logout, and then Twitter or Facebook and or. So 2 plus all social authentication you want to run. Account for registering and things like reset the password, get the list of users maybe, which is not available as a function natively in ASP Identity 1. And identity as a base class that just becomes part of your infrastructure. A thing that is not completely obvious here is that identity controller also relies on challenge result. So maybe you can create your own helper DLL and put those 2 things together. Okay, if it works, I'll be happy to give a quick demo of how login and logout really work. Okay, let me log off, and if I register, okay, I go through the regular interface. If I log in instead, this is login controller, sign in method. I want to log in via, so I can log in entering username and password or using Twitter. If I call Twitter, I'm redirected here. tfun is the name of my application, Twitter proxy, bound to consumer secrets and so forth. And I only have to sign in here, authorize the app. This application will not be able to, and that all the info you read here comes from the configuration for tfun on the Twitter site. So if the user authorizes the app, I'm back here, and this is my account. The fun is not that I've been able to authenticate via Twitter. The funny part of the story is that probably I could do this with very simple code. Well, simple but not convention-based, obscure, opaque code. Hopefully, I was good at telling you the story. Okay. And finally, go back to PowerPoint because I want to introduce to the next demo, which is about completely a replay. Oh, I have to tell you something about the storage, because in the demo there is an identity DB context class which you use to manage the store. Identity DB context is a framework class that assumes that there's an entity framework underneath. So you have to reference entity framework 6.1, for example. Of course, this also means that there's some configuration work taking place at some point. So in startup auth with a class named startup. This is an all-win pattern. So this will become the standard in the future, so get used to it. So what we do here is enable the application to use the cookie, okay, to use on the cookie temporary information about coming from authentication, social authentication. These two lines essentially replace the need of configuration stuff in web config. So how would you enable authentication, forms authentication in classic ASP.NET? You go in web config, and then you say, look, authentication type is forms, and you put the return path for login. You do exactly the same kind of things. You achieve the same here. Where path string here, this is the, so when you hit a resource that is not anonymous, this is the path where you should be redirected for authenticating, and create a cookie, an application cookie, which basically determines the name of the cookie that has to be created, and to some extent also the content. In web config, however, we have a section for entity framework, and you see that forms authentication module is removed from the pipeline, and you need to have something here to connect essentially to entity framework. This is code that is automatically added by wizards, blah 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 blah. So copy and paste, There's nothing special here, but essentially at some point you need to provide you need to provide at some point I'm trying to see where is the default connection, right? I was looking for the connection string to entity framework. There should be at some point there should be a connection string. It's called default connection, and and this is in this case I'm using a local database called Old Social. This is it's called social in the data directory in app data. Old Social ASP.NET dash name of the app dash an ID. Of course you can change this, and it's just a connection string actually. But if you change the connection string here, you must guarantee that there's a database with an expected schema. If you want to change completely the schema, it works more or less in the same way it worked with classic membership for years. You create your own store. And to make things even more interesting, I'm going to show you how to completely change the rules, and instead of using entity framework, I want to use RavenDB. But there is a reason why in my demo I'm going to use RavenDB. RavenDB because I'm curious about that. It looks to me even easier to set up for a quick demo than MongoDB or others. And more importantly, because it's a document database. So a document database means that you just pass it an instance of a .NET class, and it just persists as is. Because one of the problems you face with this approach, code first, which is used by default underneath ASP.NET Identity, is great, but code first is, okay, you give me the definition of the T-user class, and I persist it. But once me, the framework, created the database, that's it. So if you happen to change the user later, even simply during development, the database is no longer aligned. So either you drop the database and recreate, which may be acceptable during development. Otherwise, you have to provide a migration wizard. It's part of the entity framework way of working to convert the existing database to the structure of the object that is different from the original. You don't have this problem if you use, for storing user information in particular, a document database, because yes, if you have a user with 3 properties, then you have 4 properties, you need a way to distinguish between versions. It's just about distinguishing versions. So you might want to have, since at the beginning, a version number property. So that gives you the measure of what kind of object you are going to have. So let's say that using RavenDB or a document database gives you more flexibility, makes it probably easier to handle, different definition of users that change over time. But anyway, the RavenDB demo here is not necessarily an invitation to drop SQL Server in favor of a document database. It still can happen, but it's an architectural decision. But it's simply a way to show how you can rewrite the store for Asp Net identity. Okay, here we go. So in this example, I have. Let me first show you the application as it works, and I think it's the same, nearly the same application. Yeah, it takes a while to instantiate RavenDB the first time. Okay, while it takes its time to instantiate, this is the class that I'm going to write. RavenDB user store, tuser. This is the store for this type of user. It implements user store of t, user password store of t. It's mandatory. So if you handle user, you also need to implement the members for the password. Where tuser is, it could be identity user. Typical user is the type sample type from my app. But this type anyway inherits from identity user. Are we done? Not yet. Wow. This is new. Wow. It's amazing. This is still based on the same code coming from, this is the demo app, so it's the same problem I had, I don't know. Anyway, sorry about that. I really have no time to figure this out. So, but anyway, the code I wrote entirely myself worked. The code I inherited from Marco didn't. So that should tell you something. Anyway, okay, let's go through the code. The account controller class, I didn't put any effort or any significant effort here to simplify things as I did in the previous example. So, okay, it's already compact. So you will still find this associate, reducer, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, the fundamental part you see is here. New user, typical user, and then I pass RavenDB user store of t, and typical user is yeah, it has ID, username, password, and then magic code, just to make it different. Okay. This could have been simply put there. And yeah, application DB context, I'm not using this, but this is what you find normally in a project generated by Microsoft in the wizard. So I'm just not using this, and instead of this, I'm using a RavenDB store. So here it is. So everything. So in the controller class, this is the only thing I change. Okay, so everything happens within RavenDB. And now to set up RavenDB, I'm using RavenDB as embedded, so embedded in the app, so I'm not using it. You can use RavenDB as a Windows service, as an HTTP server, or embedded in your app. I'm using it embedded in the app. Okay, so there is the initialize method, which creates an embeddable document store. This is the name of the connection string in the web config. I initialize and save the document store instance, the entry point in the database, as a static member, as a singleton of this class. This happens upon loading of the application. Okay, so in the store, the first thing I do is opening the session and save this into a private member iDocument session. And after that, I just proceed creating the methods for iUser store and iUser password store. Resharper says that this is grays this out because all of the members in user store are already in iUser password. So the reason why I have both interfaces listed is to make it clear that this class acts as a user store and the user password store. But iUser password inherits from user store. So that's why resharper the text and makes this gray out. So create async, find by ID, find by name, update async, delete async, set password. These are part of iUser store. And then in addition, we have a set password hash, get password hash, and as password async. These are the methods, the three methods on the password store interface. Create async. That's all it does. The user is passed and just stored into the document session. That's enough to store the object, to serialize the object in the folds of the embeddable store of RavenDB. Find by ID and find by name. I used here just differently in the sense that probably I'm not completely sure. I mean, the sense of find by ID, which is identity, and find by name, which is identity, they refer to the fact of finding the user by ID or the display name that they call the username, right? But the implementation, the different implementation I'm using here is also a way to showcase an important aspect of RavenDB, and I think document databases in general, that is important to be aware of for people who, just like me, just have heard about document database but never practiced with them that much. So from the perspective of regular, relational, oriented developers, the big difference I see with document databases is in what they call eventual consistency. So document databases, and RavenDB in particular, is eventually consistent. So it means that when you save a record, so when you store a record, you are at some point allowed to read it back, and when you read it back, you get exactly what you have written. But there's a time in between these two operations. So storing the record doesn't guarantee that immediately after that, a millisecond later, you can read it back. The reason is in the architecture. It's deliberate aspect. It's by design. It says that because document databases are created to make writing records extremely quick, because they exist to support scenarios where scaling is essential, as if everybody was rewriting Twitter, which is not true. But anyway, that's how it works. So when you write a record, the store method that we used a moment ago triggers an index update that usually runs in the background and may take a few seconds, okay, to complete. So if you happen to read it back in an interval between the update of the record and the update of the index, what you get back is the old copy, as if no changes affected the app, that doesn't the store. So in a typical scenario in which you push the button to make an update and want to refresh the page with the updates, it doesn't work. Okay? What you see immediately is the old record, as if your update failed, which is not true because updates were successfully completed, but it just doesn't show up yet. If you repeat the operation after a few seconds, you get eventually the consistency level you expect. Okay? So this is an important point to understand. Now, RavenDB has a mechanism, a configuration aspect that can be changed so that it waits whenever you query for a type T, it checks that the index, there are no pending updates on the index for that type, and only when it detects that there are no pending changes, it returns the query. So it can be immediate if there are no pending changes, or it can take a few seconds if there are pending changes. Now, what's the difference between load and query? Query uses the index. So query is a method that is eventually consistent all the time. Load, instead, is a kind of shortcut. So it goes straight into the store. It doesn't use indexes. But this means that if you want to pick up via a direct memory access a piece of information, you must know its address. In the Raven jargon, the address is called the ID. You must know the ID of the object. Now, when you save the object with store, RavenDB has a method that gives you back the unique ID of that object. So if you know that, you can call load. And in this case, consistency is immediate. So you write and you read it back immediately. But you need to be aware and capture the ID. So this implementation makes no sense, in the sense that find by ID that uses load and find by name that uses query makes no sense. Because the ID here is not certainly going to be the ID of the Raven object, but it's the ID of the user. Okay, so, but I deliberately maintain this code as stupid as is, just to make, to give me, trigger to raise the point about eventual consistency of RavenDB databases. So you want to have, in a realistic implementation, query used also here, and make the query on the ID property. So have something like this. Instead of username, you just use ID. Okay? And to finish off, update is, again, store. Delete is called delete on document store. Set password. Yeah, you just get it. You have the password hash here. You just save to the user. Get password. Has password. So nothing special. Plain code. And you use the document section to access the store, or you do manipulation on the user object, and the structure of the user object is completely up to you. More importantly, to change the store, all you do is take your existing code that uses the default configuration, and you just rename the class here. Okay, we're almost done, nearly done. To finish off, just a couple of slides. What's new in Identity 2, which was released the 20th of March? There is a two-factor authentication, which is mechanism for which it manages authentication, like you first enter credentials, then an email service or an SMS service that can be configured in the backend as part of the API will email a pin. The user has explicitly to click the email, which will call back another method in your API for the actual two-step authentication to complete. So there's support for this. And also the user manager object has been empowered, so now it supports a delete method to delete accounts. Oh, we missed it, I'm sorry, in the first version. iQueryable on users and roles, password reset, and also account native support for locking out an account after a configurable number of failed attempts. These features were almost of which were already in the basic membership in the second version of Identity founded with. So it's still a work in progress. So in summary, it's different from the membership. In many regards, it's even better. It's slowly progressing, probably over-engineered, but I think that the point is not much of over-engineering, is not much with the API itself, which is probably good enough, but in the fact that it's poorly documented and poorly demonstrated. So the over-engineering is probably not a feature of the API in itself, but a feature that applies to the demos that they use to showcase the API. And anyway, like it or not, this is going to be the future of ASP.NET. Web forms, and so this is the way in which membership, this lives on top of OWIN. That's the future of ASP.NET. So it's still worth a try. That's it. Thank you.